Black Friday, November 28, 2008. The air was thick with it, that smell. You could detect it from 50 feet outside the mall entrance, seeping through ventilation ducts, crawling through the corridors like an invisible fog, a weaponized cologne that would cling to your clothes, embed itself in your hair, linger on your skin for days. Inside the darkened cave of Abercrombie & Fitch, bass-heavy music pounded at 93 decibels, louder than a motorcycle engine, loud enough to make conversation impossible. Strobe lights sliced through artificial fog machines. Half-naked models with sculpted abs and practiced smiles stood guard at the entrance, their bodies bronzed and perfect, like statues guarding a temple. The line to enter wrapped around the corridor, past the pretzel stand, past the food court. Parents clutched credit cards like tickets to salvation. Teenagers clutched dreams of transformation, of belonging, of finally being one of the beautiful ones. This was not a clothing store. This was a temple, a cathedral to youth and beauty and exclusivity. At its zenith, Abercrombie & Fitch operated 1,078 locations across 3 continents. Annual revenues exceeded $4.5 billion. The company employed over 90,000 people. The stock price had soared from $7 in 2003 to $84 in 2007, a 1,200% return that made early investors wealthy beyond reason. The brand had become so ubiquitous that sociologists studied it. Psychologists analyzed its appeal. Business schools taught it as a case study in aspirational marketing. Mike Jeffries, the silver-haired architect behind this empire, had accomplished what few retail executives ever do. He had made clothing transcendent. He had transformed a bankrupt outdoor retailer founded in the 19th century into the most desired brand among America's youth. He had bottled aspiration, commercialized exclusivity, and sold it at mall prices. The quarterly catalog was passed around high school cafeterias like contraband. The hoodies with the moose logo were status symbols more coveted than designer handbag. To walk into school wearing Abercrombie was to announce yourself as someone who mattered, someone who belonged. But beneath the pulsing music and the cologne clouds and the beautiful bodies, something had already begun to rot. Because what built Abercrombie & Fitch was not innovation or quality or value. It was something darker, a philosophy so toxic, so fundamentally discriminatory that it would eventually poison everything it touched. A business model constructed on a foundation of body shaming, racial exclusion, and manufactured elitism. The beast was magnificent, but the beast was already dying, and no one inside the temple could see it yet, because that is how empires always fall, not from external invasion, but from internal decay. In the stockroom of every Abercrombie & Fitch store in America, hidden behind the artfully distressed denim and the carefully folded logo hoodies, behind the piles of graphic tees that would be obsolete by next season, sat cardboard boxes containing hundreds of small glass bottles. Fear, the signature fragrance, a woody, oceanic scent with notes of citrus and musk, masculine but not aggressive, expensive but not pretentious. It had been designed by Christophe Laudamiel, a perfumer who had created scents for Coca-Cola and Victoria's Secret. The retail bottle sold for $55 in department stores, but these bottles in the stockroom were not for sale. They were ammunition. Corporate policy, handed down from headquarters in New Albany, Ohio, mandated the ritual. Every 20 minutes, without fail, an employee would emerge from the shadows, locate the nearest spray station, pump the atomizer 8 times into the air above the sales floor, and retreat. The scent was inescapable. It saturated fabric. It embedded itself in memory. It became, for millions of people, the olfactory signature of desire itself. Years later, people would smell it randomly, on a stranger passing in an airport, in the perfume aisle of a department store, and be transported instantly back to 2005, back to being 16 years old, back to the desperate, aching hunger to belong, to be beautiful, to be chosen. This was not an accident. This was psychological warfare disguised as retail strategy. This was Pavlovian conditioning with a $55 price tag. The smell said, "You are not good enough yet, but you could be, if you buy what we are selling." Before it became the empire of controversy, before it became synonymous with exclusion and corporate cruelty, Abercrombie & Fitch was something pure, something genuinely American in the Theodore Roosevelt sense, something noble. The year was 1892. Manhattan's downtown streets still echoed with the clop of horse hooves. The Gilded Age was in full bloom. Industry and ambition and westward expansion still defined the American character. David T. Abercrombie was not a businessman in the modern sense. He was a prospector, a trapper, a man who had spent years in the Montana wilderness, sleeping under stars, drinking from mountain streams, understanding survival not as theory, but as daily practice. When he returned to civilization, he was shocked by the poor quality of equipment available to outdoorsmen. The tents leaked, the rifles jammed, the clothing fell apart after one season. So he opened a small shop at 57 Reed Street in Lower Manhattan, selling camping equipment and rifles and the kind of gear that actual frontiersmen would stake their lives on. Not fashion, function. His clientele were not weekend warriors. They were genuine explorers, professional hunters, men preparing for months-long expeditions into territories where mistakes meant death. The store gained a reputation. Abercrombie was meticulous, obsessive about quality, willing to customize equipment for specific expeditions. When Theodore Roosevelt needed supplies before his legendary African safari in 1909, he shopped at Abercrombie. When Admiral Richard Byrd prepared for his Antarctic expedition in 1928, he relied on Abercrombie's tents and equipment. When Ernest Hemingway needed a shotgun, he bought it from Abercrombie. This was authenticity. This was legacy. This was craft. In 1900, a wealthy lawyer named Ezra Fitch became Abercrombie's business partner, bringing capital and business acumen. The partnership was contentious. Fitch wanted to expand and advertise, while Abercrombie preferred to stay small and selective. Eventually, Abercrombie sold his stake and retired. Fitch took full control. Under Fitch, the company exploded. They moved to a 12-story building on Madison Avenue and 45th Street. They published elaborate quarterly catalogs filled with exotic adventure stories and expensive equipment. You could buy everything from bamboo fly rods to safari tents to elephant guns. The famous 1939 catalog was 546 pages long and included a live bear trap for $17. This was the golden age, when Abercrombie and Fitch meant something real. But authenticity, as it turns out, does not scale infinitely. By the 1960s and 70s, the outdoor market had fundamentally changed. Competitors like REI and LL Bean were offering similar quality at lower prices. Suburban shopping malls were replacing downtown flagship stores. The customer base was aging. Younger generations did not aspire to African safaris or hunting expeditions. They aspired to rock concerts and road trips. Abercrombie and Fitch tried to adapt. They opened new locations. They added casual wear. They attempted to become more accessible, but in doing so, they lost their identity. They were no longer the definitive outfitter for genuine adventurers. They were just another sporting goods store competing on price with better-positioned rivals. The company changed hands multiple times. Each owner tried a different strategy. Each strategy failed. The 12-story Madison Avenue flagship closed. Stores were shuttered. Debt accumulated. In 1977, after 85 years in business, Abercrombie and Fitch declared bankruptcy. The hunting rifles and canvas tents and ghosts of Theodore Roosevelt were liquidated at pennies on the dollar. The name, that beautiful aristocratic name with its three-syllable cadence, was sold to Oshman's Sporting Goods for $1.5 million. They had purchased a corpse, but they did not know yet what monster they were about to resurrect. Leslie Wexner did not look like a revolutionary. He looked like a bland Midwestern businessman, which is exactly what he was. But he had built The Limited, a mall-based retail empire, from a single store in Columbus, Ohio, into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. He understood something fundamental about American consumer psychology. People do not buy clothes to cover their body. They buy clothes to construct identity. In 1988, The Limited purchased the Abercrombie & Fitch brand for $45 million. The outdoor heritage? Irrelevant. The quality craftsmanship? Too expensive. The authentic connection to American exploration? Obsolete. Wexner kept only the name. That beautiful, aristocratic, three-syllable name. Abercrombie. It sounded expensive. It sounded East Coast. It sounded like prep schools and sailing and old money, even though the company was now headquartered in suburban Ohio, 40 minutes from the cornfield. For 4 years, Abercrombie existed as a small subsidiary within the Limited empire, operating a handful of stores aimed at businessmen. It sold suit jackets and briefcases. It was boring. It was dying again. Then, in 1992, Wexner made the decision that would change everything. He hired Michael Jeffries. Michael Stanton Jeffries was 58 years old when he took control of Abercrombie & Fitch. He had worked in retail his entire adult life, stints at various department stores and mall brands with mixed success. He was not particularly charismatic. He was not a natural leader, but he understood something about teenage psychology that bordered on supernatural. Teenagers do not want good clothes. They want a uniform that signals belonging. Jeffries studied the social hierarchies of American high schools with the intensity of an anthropologist studying a primitive tribe. He observed the jocks, the cheerleaders, the beautiful ones who seemed to glide through hallways untouched by the ordinary laws of adolescent suffering, the ones who sat at the center table in the cafeteria, the ones who determined who was cool and who was invisible, and he asked himself a simple question. What if a brand could bottle that? What if you could commercialize social status? What if belonging could be purchased at a mall? He gutted everything. The business attire? Gone. The outdoor heritage, erased from marketing material, the quality craftsmanship, downgraded to maximize margins. He kept only the name, and he began building his vision. The stores would be dark. Why? Because nightclubs are dark. Because darkness hides imperfection. Because dim lighting creates mystery and exclusivity. The music would be loud. Why? Because loud music makes people hurry, creating urgency. Because it makes conversation difficult, discouraging questions about price or quality. Because loud music is what cool places have. The staff would be beautiful, extremely beautiful, hired not for retail experience or customer service skills, but for physical appearance. They would be called brand representatives, not employees, because they were not selling clothes. They were embodying an aspirational lifestyle. And the clothes themselves? Simple, deliberately simple, logo-heavy to the point of absurdity. The brand name emblazoned across chests in letters 6 inches tall, because subtlety is for people who are already secure in their status. Teenagers need to advertise their affiliation. Jeffries hired Bruce Weber, the legendary fashion photographer known for his homoerotic imagery and his ability to capture idealized youth. Weber had shot campaigns for Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren. His aesthetic was sun-drenched nostalgia, golden bodies on beaches, tousled hair, the implication of sex without the explicit act. The quarterly magalogues Weber produced for Abercrombie were not catalogue. They were softcore pornography disguised as lifestyle magazine. 300 pages of barely clothed teenagers in suggestive poses. Minimal clothing, maximum implication. The actual products were almost incidental. You had to search through pages of bare torsos to find a shirt. The publications became collector's items. They were hidden under mattresses, passed around locker rooms, discussed in whispers. Some parents tried to ban them, which, of course, only increased their desirability among teenagers. This was not retail. This was cultural engineering. One store opened, then 5, then 10. By 1996, there were 113 stores. The formula was working with terrifying efficiency. Wall Street took notice. In 1996, the Limited spun off Abercrombie & Fitch as an independent publicly traded company. The IPO raised nearly $50 million. Investors who bought stock on the first day would see returns of over 900% within 5 years. Mike Jeffries was now a CEO, and he had a vision so absolute, so unyielding, that it would eventually destroy everything. By 2000, Abercrombie & Fitch had metastasized 336 stores, $1.2 billion in annual revenue. The brand had transcended fashion and become a cultural force. But behind the carefully curated facade, behind the beautiful models and the pounding music, was a machine. A cold, brutal, ruthlessly efficient machine that consumed human beings and converted them into brand compliance. The hiring policy was explicit, though never officially codified in writing. Store managers were given what employees called the lookbook, a photo guide showing acceptable and unacceptable body types, facial features, hair colors, and skin tone. Acceptable: white or white adjacent. Thin but not skeletal. Toned but not excessively muscular. Conventionally attractive by the narrow standards of early 2000s suburban mall culture. Blonde hair strongly preferred. Blue eyes a significant bonus. The ideal employee looked like they had just walked off a beach in Southern California, even if the store was in Minnesota in February. Unacceptable: overweight, visibly ethnic features, darker skin tone, unconventional facial piercing, tattoos, anything that deviated from Jeffries' vision of classic American beauty, which was, not coincidentally, a vision that excluded most of America. Store managers were instructed to recruit from college fraternities and sororities. They were told to visit gyms and approach attractive people. If someone who did not fit the aesthetic applied for a job, they were politely redirected to stockroom positions, out of sight, invisible. Abercrombie's public face was to be exclusively beautiful. The people handling merchandise in the back could look however they wanted. They just could not be seen. The training manual was explicit about this distinction. Brand representatives worked the sales floor, greeted customers, embodied the lifestyle. They earned slightly higher wages and were subject to regular appearance evaluation. Impact associates worked in stockrooms, processing shipments, tagging merchandise. They could be any race, any body type, any level of conventional attractiveness. They just had to stay hidden. The lawsuits would come later. Multiple lawsuits, massive settlements. But in the glory years, from 1996 to 2008, this discrimination was simply called brand integrity. Here is the dirty secret of Abercrombie & Fitch. The clothes were mediocre. The The quality was unremarkable. The fabrics were standard cotton blends, indistinguishable from competitors. The construction was basic. No innovative seams, no technical features, no groundbreaking cuts. The designs were aggressively simple. Distressed jeans with deliberate rips, logo t-shirts, hoodies with Abercrombie and Fitch or A&F emblazoned across the chest in letters visible from 50 yards away. There was no innovation here. No reason, based purely on quality or design, to choose Abercrombie over any other mall brand. But that was precisely the point. You were not buying a shirt. You were buying the Moose logo. You were buying social permission to walk into school wearing the uniform of the elite. The prices were deliberately inflated to reinforce this exclusivity. A plain t-shirt, solid color, no design, just the Abercrombie logo, cost $48. A hoodie cost $78. A pair of jeans cost $89. The markup was obscene, often 400 to 500% over cost, but expensive meant exclusive. Expensive meant not everyone could have it, and that scarcity generated hunger in a way that reasonable pricing never could. Jeffries understood a fundamental principle of luxury goods. Perceived value is more powerful than actual value. A Mercedes is not significantly better engineered than a Honda. A Rolex does not tell time more accurately than a Timex, but the Mercedes driver and the Rolex wearer are purchasing status, not function. They are purchasing the ability to say, I can afford this, and you cannot. Abercrombie applied luxury brand psychology to mall prices. It was democratized elitism, the illusion of exclusivity available to anyone with a credit card. And American teenagers devoured it. Inside the corporate headquarters in New Albany, Ohio, a carefully planned company town that Wexner had essentially built from farmland, Mike Jeffries ruled like a tyrant from a previous century. The office environment was controlled to an obsessive degree. Employees were forbidden from wearing black. Why? Because Jeffries believed black was depressing. The dress code mandated Abercrombie clothing exclusively. Windows were covered with blinds to control natural light. The temperature was kept at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Specific music playlists, approved by Jeffries personally, played throughout the building. His personal office was a climate-controlled sanctuary that required specific lighting, specific temperature, and, reportedly, a specific soundtrack of aircraft engine sounds because he found them soothing. Employees who met with him were given preparatory instructions about where to stand, how to make eye contact, what topics were forbidden. He flew by private jet to inspect stores, arriving unannounced to critique every detail that deviated from his vision. The lighting was wrong. The music was too quiet. The staff member at the entrance was not attractive enough. The cologne spray schedule was not being followed. Every imperfection was noted. Every deviation was corrected. Stories circulated among employees. Jeffries once ordered an entire store's staff to be replaced because he felt they did not represent the brand adequately. He allegedly paid attractive people to stand in front of stores and create the illusion of a cool crowd. He micromanaged store layouts to the placement of individual hangers. This was not leadership. This was obsession. An unhealthy, all-consuming obsession with an aesthetic ideal that existed only in his mind. And for a while, it worked, because teenagers are not rational consumers. They do not evaluate value or quality. They evaluate social currency. And Abercrombie & Fitch, under Jeffries' tyrannical vision, had become the most valuable social currency available in American malls. Success breeds expansion, and expansion breeds subsidiaries. In 2000, Abercrombie launched Hollister Co., a surf-inspired brand positioned slightly below Abercrombie in price point and aimed at younger teenagers. The stores were designed to look like California beach shack, complete with artificial skylights, showing perpetual blue sky, sand on the floors, and that same psychological manipulation. Dim lighting, loud music, attractive staff. Hollister exploded. Within 5 years, it was generating over $1 billion in annual revenue. The formula was proven: manufacture exclusivity, hire beautiful people, create an aspirational fantasy, sell logo-heavy clothing at premium prices. In 2008, Abercrombie launched Jilly Hicks, an underwear and sleepwear brand targeting young women. The stores were designed like inner sanctums, with even darker lighting and explicitly sexual imagery. It was Victoria's Secret for teenagers. Rue Elle New. 925 launched in 2004. Targeting college graduates and young professionals with higher-end leather goods and apparel. The stores were designed to look like Greenwich Village apartments, complete with vintage furniture and exposed brick. The empire was growing. The stock price was soaring. Jeffries was hailed as a retail genius. Business schools taught his strategies. Wall Street analysts praised his discipline. But empires built on exclusion always carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. By 2006, The spray of fierce had evolved beyond atmosphere. It had become weaponized. Customer complaints poured in. The cologne was so aggressive that people with asthma or respiratory sensitivities could not enter the stores. Parents complained of headaches lasting hours after brief visit. Employees reported nausea and dizziness from 8-hour shifts in the fog. Mall management began receiving formal complaints. Other retailers protested that the smell invaded their spaces, that customers were avoiding entire corridors because the Abercrombie fragrance was overwhelming. Abercrombie and Fitch did not care. The smell was part of the brand, part of the exclusivity. If you could not handle the sensory assault, you were not their target customer. The message was clear. This space is not for everyone, and we are proud of that. The spray had become a moat, a chemical barrier around the castle. And inside the castle, Jeffries sat on his throne, convinced of his own invincibility. But outside, the world was changing. Social media was rising. Transparency was becoming valued. Inclusion was becoming cool, and Abercrombie and Fitch was standing on the wrong side of history. The interview was conducted in 2006 with Salon magazine. It would sit relatively unnoticed for 7 years before exploding like a delayed bomb. Mike Jeffries sat in his carefully controlled office and decided to say the quiet part out loud, to articulate the philosophy that everyone who worked at Abercrombie understood implicitly but never stated explicitly. We go after the attractive all-American kid with a great attitude and a lot of friends. A lot of people don't belong in our clothes, and they can't belong. Are we exclusionary? Absolutely. Those companies that are in trouble are trying to target everybody. Young, old, fat, skinny. But then you become totally vanilla. You don't alienate anybody, but you don't excite anybody either. He continued, digging deeper. We hire good-looking people in our stores because good-looking people attract other good-looking people, and we want to market to cool, good-looking people. We don't market to anyone other than that. And then, the most damaging line. In every school, there are the cool and popular kids, and then there are the not-so-cool kids. Candidly, we go after the cool kid. We go after the attractive all-American kid with a great attitude and a lot of friends. A lot of people don't belong, and they can't belong. The philosophy behind the empire, stated plainly, cruelly, proudly. For years, this had been obvious to anyone who walked into the stores, to anyone who noticed the homogeneous staff, to anyone who saw that the largest women's size was a 10, to anyone who observed that the marketing materials featured exclusively white, thin, conventionally attractive teenagers. But there is a profound difference between an unspoken policy and a CEO articulating it as corporate gospel, as a feature, not a bug, as something to be proud of. And in that moment of arrogant candor, Mike Jeffries planted a time bomb under his empire. He just did not know it yet. The legal troubles had actually begun earlier, but few people outside the company paid attention. In November 2004, Abercrombie settled a class action lawsuit brought by the NAACP, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and several other civil rights organizations. The evidence was damning. Store managers had been recorded making explicitly racist comments. Job applicants of color were systematically rejected or directed to stockroom positions. Asian, Black, and Latino employees described being told they could not work on the sales floor because they did not fit the look. The settlement cost Abercrombie $50 million, one of the largest racial discrimination settlements in retail history. The company was required to implement diversity initiatives, hire a vice president of diversity, and submit to external monitoring. But nothing fundamentally changed. The court could mandate policy, but it could not change Jeffries' vision. And Jeffries' vision was absolute. In 2008, a 17-year-old British teen named Rhiam Dean, who was born without a left arm and wore a prosthetic, was told she could not work on the sales floor of the Hollister store in London because she did not fit the look policy. She was offered a stockroom position. She sued. Abercrombie settled for £8,000 and international humiliation. In 2010, a young Muslim woman named Samantha Elif applied for a position at an Abercrombie kids store in Oklahoma. She wore a hijab as part of her religious practice. She was not hired. The reason, according to internal notes, was that her headscarf violated the company's look policy, which prohibited caps or head covering. She sued. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In June 2015, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in favor of Elif. Justice Antonin Scalia, writing for the majority, noted that an employer cannot refuse to hire an applicant based on religious practice unless accommodating that practice would cause undue hardship. The company's aesthetic preferences did not constitute undue hardship. Another settlement. Another wave of negative publicity. Another crack in the foundation. But the empire was still standing. The stock price, while volatile, remained relatively strong. The stores were still packed. The formula was still working. Then came 2013. In May 2013, someone on the internet rediscovered the 2006 salon interview. The quotes were shared on Tumblr, then Twitter, then Facebook. They went viral in a way that viral had not quite meant in 2006. Within days, millions of people had read Jeffries' words. A lot of people don't belong in our clothes, and they can't belong. The backlash was immediate and savage. Activists organized boycotts. Celebrities publicly condemned the brand. Greg Carber, a filmmaker, launched a publicity stunt called Fitch the Homeless, buying Abercrombie clothing from thrift stores and donating it to homeless people, specifically to rebrand Abercrombie as clothing for the marginalized rather than the elite. Actor Kirstie Alley tweeted her disgust. Singer Miley Cyrus, at the height of her fame, joined the pile-on. Countless think pieces were written dissecting the toxic culture Jeffries had created. A Change.org petition demanding that Abercrombie produce plus-size clothing gained over 75,000 signatures. The petition pointed out that Abercrombie's largest women's size was a 10, effectively excluding 67% of American women. Fashion bloggers, particularly plus-size bloggers, dissected every problematic aspect of the company's history: the discriminatory hiring, the exclusionary marketing, the refusal to produce larger sizes, not because of cost or logistics, but because Jeffries did not want fat people wearing his brand. And here is what made 2013 different from 2006. In 2006, social media was nascent. Outrage could be contained, managed, spun by corporate PR. By 2013, social media was omnipresent. A teenager in Ohio could share their experience of being rejected by Abercrombie for being not attractive enough, and within hours, 50,000 people would read it. Transparency had become unavoidable, and under that light, Abercrombie looked monstrous. The cultural moment had shifted. Millennials and early Gen Z were not their parents. They did not blindly consume. They interrogated ethics. They demanded accountability. They understood, perhaps for the first time in commercial history, that a brand's values mattered as much as its aesthetic. Body positivity was rising as a movement. Diversity was becoming not just a moral imperative, but a market advantage. The narrow definition of beauty that Jeffries had weaponized was being challenged by millions of young people who had grown up being told they were not good enough, not thin enough, not white enough to belong. And suddenly, Abercrombie & Fitch was not cool anymore. It was embarrassing. It was what your out-of-touch parents thought was cool. It was the brand that had explicitly told millions of teenagers that they did not belong. You do not easily forgive that. You do not easily forget being told you are not attractive enough to wear a logo. Stories like Abercrombie & Fitch are warnings written in cologne and bankruptcy filing. They are blueprints of how empires fall, not from external competition, but from internal rot, from arrogance that mistakes a moment for eternity. If you find value in these corporate autopsies, in understanding the machinery behind the facades, consider subscribing. These investigations take time. Your support allows us to continue excavating the ruins of America's commercial landscape, to find the lessons buried beneath the rubble. The stock price began its long collapse. In 2012, shares traded at $78. By the end of 2014, they had fallen to $31. Thousands of investors lost millions. Store traffic plummeted. Same-store sales declined quarter after quarter. The quarterly reports read like medical charts tracking the progress of a disease: -3%, -7%, -10%. Jeffries tried to adapt, sort of. The company issued a carefully worded apology, though it never mentioned Jeffries by name and never actually used the word sorry. They announced they would expand size range. They promised to implement diversity initiatives that went beyond court-mandated minimum, but it was too little, too late. The damage was done. A generation of consumers had been alienated, and in the age of social media, brand rehabilitation is nearly impossible. The internet never forgets. Screenshots are forever. And Mike Jeffries, the architect of the empire, the man who had built a $4 billion company on exclusion and manufactured elitism, still believed he was right. Walking into an Abercrombie & Fitch store in 2015 was like visiting a ghost ship still sailing with a dead crew at the helm. The music still pounded, but it sounded desperate now, like a club that cannot admit the party is over. The lights were still dimmed to near darkness, but it no longer seemed mysterious, just depressing. The cologne still sprayed every 20 minutes, but the smell had gone from alluring to nauseating, a perfume covering the stench of decay. The half-naked models still stood at the entrance, but they looked uncomfortable now, aware that their role had gone from aspirational to pathetic. Teenagers walked past the stores without entering. The social currency of the logo had not just devalued, it had become worthless. Worse than worthless, it had become anti-cool. Inside, the racks were disorganized. Sizes were missing. The brand representatives looked bored and defeated. The carefully curated aesthetic had degraded into chaos. When your entire business model is cool, and you stop being cool, there is nothing left. No quality to fall back on. No customer loyalty, no unique value proposition besides the logo. Just overpriced hoodies in an empty room. In fiscal year 2014, comparable store sales declined 7%. In 2015, they declined 10%. Revenue dropped from $4.5 billion in 2012 to $3.5 billion in 2015. A loss of $1 billion in 3 years. The company began its desperate retreat. Store closures were announced in waves: 60 stores, then 100, then 180. Each closure represented dozens of jobs lost, millions in lease obligations written off, another hole in the ship taking on water. The subsidiary brands, those offshoots that had once seemed like brilliant expansion strategies, were shuttered one by one. Gilly Hicks died quietly in 2013. The stores were closed, the inventory liquidated, the brand was erased from existence. Rule number 925 had already been killed in 2010, before the main crisis. It had never gained traction. The target demographic, sophisticated post-college young professionals, were not interested in buying expensive clothing from a mall brand with declining cachet. Even Hollister, which had briefly seemed like it might survive, began hemorrhaging money. Same-store sales declined. Hundreds of locations closed. The surf-casual aesthetic that had seemed fresh in 2005 felt dated in 2015. The company was not just shrinking, it was collapsing. While Abercrombie burned, its competitors feasted on the ashes. American Eagle Outfitters, once considered Abercrombie's poor cousin, had quietly built a better business model. They offered similar aesthetic at lower prices. Their stores were brightly lit and welcoming. Their sizing was inclusive. Their marketing featured diverse models. They did not make customers feel inadequate. They made them feel included. By 2015, American Eagle's market capitalization exceeded Abercrombie's by over $1 billion. Fast fashion giants like H&M and Zara had mastered what Abercrombie could not: rapid trend response at rock-bottom prices. Why spend $78 on an Abercrombie hoodie that would be out of style next year, when you could spend $19 at H&M and replace it every season? Forever 21 offered the aspirational mall aesthetic without the toxic exclusivity. Their stores were chaotic and crowded, but teenagers did not care. They cared about price and variety and the ability to buy 10 items instead of 2. Online retailers like ASOS offered infinite selection without the humiliation of shopping in a dark, cologne-saturated cave where employees judged your appearance. The retail landscape had fundamentally shifted. Mall traffic was declining as e-commerce rose. The brands that survived were those that adapted: strong online presence, inclusive sizing, transparent ethics, value pricing. Abercrombie had none of these. It had only the increasingly toxic legacy of Mike Jeffries' vision. On December 9, 2014, Abercrombie & Fitch announced that Mike Jeffries would step down as CEO. He was 69 years old. He had run the company for 22 years. The board framed it as a retirement. The financial press understood it as a firing. His severance package was $27 million. The architect of the disaster walked away wealthy while the company he had built burned. Arthur Martinez, a retail veteran who had successfully turned around Sears in the 1990s, was brought in to stabilize the ship. His mandate was clear: fix this or sink trying. The changes came rapidly. The stores were made brighter. The music was turned down. The cologne spray policy was relaxed, though not eliminated. The shirtless models at the entrance were phased out. The size range was expanded to include XL and XXL for women. The marketing materials began featuring more diverse models, though critics noted it felt performative rather than genuine. But here is the cruel truth about brand rehabilitation. You can change everything and people will still remember who you were. An entire generation had grown up either rejected by Abercrombie or complicit in its exclusionary culture. That memory does not fade because you changed your lighting or expanded your size chart. You do not easily forget being told you were not good enough. By 2018, they had reformulated Fierce, made it lighter, less aggressive. In some stores, they stopped the mandatory spraying altogether. Corporate listened to the complaints about headaches and respiratory irritation. But walk into a thrift store today, into the second-hand sections of a Goodwill or Salvation Army, and you might find an old Abercrombie hoodie from 2006. Pick it up, hold it to your face, smell it. The Fierce is still there, faded but unmistakable. a ghost trapped in fabric refusing to leave, and for a moment you are transported to the mall in 2005, to being young and desperate to belong, to wanting so badly to be chosen, to be beautiful enough, to be cool enough. The smell of exclusion never quite washes out, no matter how many times you launder the fabric, no matter how many years pass. Some stains are permanent. Drive across America today. Visit the dead malls, those cathedrals of commerce slowly being reclaimed by nature and time. Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio, just 40 miles from Abercrombie's corporate headquarters, collapsed entirely in 2016. The structure was demolished, but before the bulldozers came, urban explorers photographed the interior. Vines growing through skylight, birds nesting in the food court, water pooling on the cracked tile floors. Somewhere in that decay, there was an Abercrombie & Fitch store. The fixtures rusted. The drywall crumbled, but if you stood in that space and closed your eyes, you could almost hear it. The bass, the spray, the laughter of beautiful teenagers who thought they were invincible. Randall Park Mall in Cleveland, Owings Mills Mall in Baltimore, Dixie Square Mall in Chicago, dozens of others, ghost structures haunted by the brands that once defined them. And in each one, somewhere in the ruins, there is likely a former Abercrombie location. The moose logo faded on cracked walls, the smell, impossibly, still lingering. These are not just retail failures. These are archaeological sites, ruins of an empire built on exclusion and destroyed by its own arrogance. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Abercrombie & Fitch still exists, and against all odds, against all reasonable predictions, it has found a second life. In 2017, Fran Horowitz was named CEO. She was a company veteran, having worked her way up through the Hollister brand. But unlike Jeffries, she understood that the world had changed, that exclusion was no longer aspirational, that the teenagers who had once worshipped Abercrombie were now adults with their own children, and they remembered the pain of being told they did not belong. The transformation was radical. The stores were completely redesigned, bright lighting, normal music volume, no cologne spraying, no shirtless models. The aesthetic shifted from nightclub to boutique. The product line matured. Instead of targeting 16-year-olds, Horowitz aimed at 28-year-olds, people who had nostalgia for the brand but wanted adult quality and fit. The logo was minimized, no more 6-inch letters across chests. The designs became sophisticated, subtle, European-influenced. The sizing expanded genuinely, not performatively. The marketing featured diverse models in body type, race, and age. The company hired older models, featured real customers, and emphasized inclusivity not as a legal requirement but as a core value. It was as if the company had performed an exorcism. The ghost of Mike Jeffries' vision was expelled. And improbably, impossibly, it worked. By 2022, the stock price had recovered to over $100 per share. By 2024, it surpassed $160. Revenue stabilized and began growing again. The turnaround was hailed by business analysts as one of the most remarkable retail resurrections in modern history. But this is not the same company. The people who shop at Abercrombie in 2024 are not the same as those who shopped there in 2004. The teenagers of the Jeffries era are gone, scattered to fast fashion and online retailers and brands that never made them feel inadequate. The new customer base is older, wealthier, less concerned with social status, and more concerned with quality and fit. They are buying Abercrombie not because it is cool, but because it is competent, because the jeans fit well and the sweaters do not pill after 3 washes. This is not triumph. This is survival through amputation. The company cut off its own diseased limb and grew something new in its place. Ask a 35-year-old today about Abercrombie & Fitch and watch them squirm. They will remember wanting it desperately. They will remember the status it conferred. They will remember walking into school wearing that moose logo with pride, feeling, for a moment, like they belonged to something exclusive. And they will remember, now, what that pride was built on: the discrimination, the body shaming, the casual racism, the explicit message that some people simply did not deserve to belong. They will remember being complicit, or being victim, or both. This is Abercrombie's true legacy, not the turnaround, not the stock price recovery, but the cultural lesson it taught, painfully and publicly, that manufactured exclusivity is not sustainable. That discrimination, even when branded as aspirational marketing, will eventually poison the well. That you cannot build an empire by telling people they are not good enough, because eventually They stop believing you. They stop caring. And they build a world where your definition of good enough is irrelevant. When business historians examine the collapse of Abercrombie and Fitch, they will identify multiple contributing factors. E-commerce disruption, certainly. Online shopping fundamentally changed retail. The mall as social gathering place declined. Teenagers no longer needed to physically go to stores to see and be seen. Fast fashion competition, absolutely. H&M, Zara, Forever 21, and others offered similar aesthetics at a fraction of the price, with faster trend response. Economic factors. The 2008 recession hurt discretionary spending among Abercrombie's target demographic. Parents were less willing to spend $80 on a hoodie their child would outgrow in 6 months. Changing mall culture. Mall traffic declined broadly. Department stores anchoring malls began failing. The entire ecosystem that Abercrombie depended on was collapsing. All of these are true. All of them are insufficient explanation, because the real cause of death was philosophical. It was the belief that exclusion could be profitable forever, that you could build a fortune by telling people they were not thin enough, not white enough, not attractive enough to wear your logo. That beauty and belonging could be gatekept by a CEO who genuinely believed in dividing the world into cool kids and everyone else. Mike Jeffries had engineered a perfect machine for the early 2000s. A cultural moment when exclusionary marketing was not just acceptable, but aspirational. When discrimination could hide behind brand identity. When teenagers would tolerate being made to feel inadequate if it meant access to social status. But he built his machine with no ability to adapt, no capacity to evolve. He created a brand so inflexible, so welded to a single narrow vision of beauty and worth, that when the culture moved, as culture always does, the brand could not follow. And so it died. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, painfully, publicly, watching its empire crumble one closed store at a time. The beast was magnificent, but the beast was built on rot, and rot always spreads. There is a particular type of tragedy reserved for brands like Abercrombie and Fitch. They do not simply fail financially, they become embarrassing. They become the thing you once loved, but now cannot admit to loving without caveat, without apology. They become the evidence of who you were when you did not know better. Ask any millennial about Abercrombie, and you will hear variations of the same confession. I used to love it, but now I realize. The sentence trails off. What they realize is too uncomfortable to articulate fully. That they participated in something cruel. That they derived status from exclusion. That they wore their Moose logo hoodies with pride, while other kids stood outside the store, unable to afford entry into that golden tribe. This discomfort is Abercrombie's true legacy. The mall is quieter now. The stores that remain have adapted or died. The teenagers who once lined up for Abercrombie shop online now, from brands that promise inclusivity and sustainability and ethical labor practices. Brands that would never say, some people don't belong in our clothes. Walk past a former Abercrombie location. Maybe it is a different store now. A phone case kiosk, a vitamin shop, a vacant space with paper covering the windows, and a coming soon sign that has been there for 3 years. Stand there for a moment. Close your eyes. You can almost hear it. The bass pounding through walls. The spray of fierce every 20 minutes. The rustle of logo hoodies being folded by beautiful employees in the semi-darkness. The laughter of teenagers who believed, truly believed, that the Moose logo made them special. And beneath it all, if you listen carefully, you can hear something else. The sound of an empire rotting from the inside out. The sound of arrogance mistaking a moment for eternity. The sound of exclusion eating itself alive. What remains of a $4 billion dream built on the systematic exclusion of anyone who did not fit one man's narrow definition of beauty? A reformed company trying, genuinely it seems, to atone for its past? Yes. A generation of adults wrestling with complicity and shame? Certainly. A cautionary tale taught in business schools about the dangers of inflexible vision? Absolutely. A cultural lesson about the unsustainability of manufactured exclusivity? Perhaps the most important one, but also something smaller, something more personal, a smell, that persistent, haunting, weaponized smell. Fierce. The cologne that was sprayed religiously every 20 minutes in over 1,000 stores. The scent that embedded itself so deeply in cultural memory that catching a whiff of it today, on a stranger, in an airport, in a second-hand store, in a randomly opened drawer, can transport you instantly back. Back to the mall in 2005. Back to being 16 and desperate. Back to standing outside the dark cave of Abercrombie, looking at the beautiful people inside and wondering if you would ever be good enough to join them. The smell remains, fading, dispersing, but persistent. A ghost that refuses to leave. A stain that will not wash out. An accusation that lingers in the air. This is what remains of Abercrombie and Fitch's empire, not buildings or balance sheets, but memory, cultural memory, the kind that cannot be rehabilitated or rebranded or written off as a loss, the kind that stays, fierce, fading, forgotten.